Welcome, fellow
Hey
wanderer
there,
of the long
sleepy
dark,
wasteland
to the story of a
wanderers.
man the earth
Tonight,
refused to keep
we're diving
wrapped in
into the
fire
haunting
and
beauty
thrown into
of
a
the
canyon,
Fallout universe,
and yet somehow,
where broken
impossibly,
cities
returned.
whisper forgotten stories.
Tonight we trace the
and every
full
shadow
arc of
hides
Joshua
a tale
Graham,
of survival.
from the
I'll
missionary
be your
communities
guide through
of the
these
post-war
glowing
desert,
ruins,
through the
sharing
building of an
quiet
empire
moments of hope,
and the military
resilience,
defeat that
and the
ended his
eerie
place within
calm
it,
of a world long
through the
gone.
canyon floor and the long climb back, and the second life that the wasteland's mythology was never quite adequate to describe. So settle in, let the red stone walls rise around you in the dark, and let your breathing slow. Close your eyes when you are ready. There is no need to hold on to every word. Simply let the story find you, gentle as canyon light at dusk, and carry you towards sleep. The community that produced Joshua Graham was not the kind of community that the post-war wasteland's dominant narratives tend to accommodate easily, because it was a community organized around principles that the wasteland's pragmatic and immediate frameworks did not have adequate categories for principles of theological commitment and doctrinal seriousness, and the specific form of outward directed care that the missionary tradition had developed across centuries of practice in environments that had not been designed to welcome it. The New Canaanites were the inheritors of the pre-war Mormon tradition, which had itself been shaped across its own long and demanding history by the specific experience of surviving in places that were hostile to survival, of maintaining community cohesion under conditions that challenged it, of carrying forward a way of life whose specific character required active and sustained effort to preserve against the various pressures that the surrounding world brought to bear against it. This was not the inheritance of a tradition that had known only comfort and acceptance. It was the inheritance of a tradition that had learned, through direct experience repeated across generations, exactly what the maintenance of a distinctive communal identity under adverse conditions required of the people committed to maintaining it, and whose practical capacities had been shaped accordingly. Joshua Graham was born into this community and formed by it in the specific and deep way that communities of genuine conviction form the people who grow up within them, not through formal instruction alone, though the formal instruction was real and rigorous, but through the ambient transmission of the community's entire orientation toward the world, the specific way of seeing and valuing and engaging with things that the tradition had developed and that the community reproduced in its members through the daily texture of shared life within it. He grew up inside a community that took seriously the obligation to extend itself outward, to go toward the people the wasteland contained, rather than simply fortifying itself against them, and the specific capabilities that effective missionary work required were capabilities the community deliberately cultivated in the people it prepared for that work. Languages above all, because the commitment to meeting people in their own linguistic reality, rather than requiring them to inhabit yours, was a commitment the tradition held as a form of genuine respect, a recognition that another person's language was the primary medium of their specific humanity, and that the willingness to learn it was among the most concrete demonstrations available of the seriousness with which you took that humanity. Joshua Graham learned languages the way the tradition intended its missionaries, to learn them as acts of attention to specific people rather than as acquisitions of tools for influence, and the specific capability he developed was exceptional even within a community that valued the capability highly. The facility with languages that would eventually define his usefulness to a person he had not yet met was therefore not a capability developed in isolation from the values of the community that developed it. And this original context matters for understanding the subsequent history of how the capability was used. The same skill that allowed him to meet tribal communities in their own linguistic reality, that allowed him to engage with the specific texture of their particular ways of organizing the world, was the skill that would later be deployed in service of a project whose relationship to genuine respect for the people whose languages it was using was deeply and fundamentally compromised. The gap between what the capability was originally for and what it eventually served is one of the more important gaps in the story of how Joshua Graham became the Malpais legate. And the gap is not adequately accounted for by any narrative that treats the subsequent history as simply the revelation of what was always there beneath the missionary surface. The encounter between Joshua Graham and Edward Sallow was the contingent event at the center of everything that followed, and its contingency, the specific accident of timing and location and circumstance that placed these two particular people in the same territory at the same moment, deserves more attention than the subsequent mythology of both men has typically given it. Sallow was a member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, the scholarly organization whose commitment to the preservation and transmission of pre-war knowledge had sent him into the tribal territories of the Mojave with the specific research agenda of an anthropologist interested in the province. Various forms of post-war social organization that the tribal communities of the region had developed. He was not, at the point of the encounter, a figure of any particular significance in the wasteland's larger narrative. He was a scholar with an interesting idea, the idea that the specific historical model of Roman civilization, with its particular combination of military discipline and administrative sophistication and territorial expansion, offered a viable template for the kind of large-scale social organization that the post-war wasteland lacked and required, and with the specific frustration of someone whose interesting idea had not yet found the practical vehicle capable of giving it operational form. Graham had the vehicle, he had the languages, the cultural competence, the tactical capability, and the established relationships with the tribal communities whose cooperation would be necessary to translate Sallow's theoretical framework into the physical reality of an institution. What he lacked was the framework itself, the specific conceptual architecture that gave the capabilities a direction and a purpose larger than the individual missionary or protective functions they had previously served. The meeting between these two particular sets of capabilities was the meeting that made Caesar's Legion possible, and it is worth holding on to the contingency of that meeting, the fact that it did not have to happen, that the specific combination it produced was the product of a specific accident rather than an inevitable expression of pre-existing forces, because the contingency is part of what the story of Graham's responsibility for. What the Legion became actually means. The construction of what became Caesar's Legion was not the instantaneous transformation of a theoretical framework into an operational institution. It was a process, conducted over years and across the specific and various resistances that the project of unifying tribal communities, whose interests and identities were organized around their distinctiveness, naturally encountered, and Graham's role in that process was not secondary. He was the person who made the project militarily viable, who developed the specific tactics and the specific training and the specific institutional culture that transformed the various tribal groups Caesar was absorbing from, independent communities with their own military traditions, into something that functioned at the operational level as a unified force. The Malpais legate was not a title inherited from a pre-existing institutional tradition, but a role created through the specific combination of Graham's capabilities and the specific demands of the project Caesar had organized his life around, and the specific character of what Graham built within the Legion's military structure bore his specific imprint in ways that distinguished it from what Caesar's theoretical framework alone would have produced. The relationship between the two men who built the Legion together was, across the full span of its duration before the canyon, a relationship of genuine interdependence, the specific and demanding form of interdependence that develops between people who have built something significant together and who each understand that the other's contribution was not incidental but essential to what the thing they built actually became. Caesar had the vision and the intellectual framework and the specific authority that his self-construction as a living embodiment of Roman historical precedent was designed to establish and maintain. Graham had the practical capability that translated the vision into the physical reality of a functional military institution. Neither contribution was dispensable to the project. and both men's understanding of their own indispensability was part of what made the relationship's eventual transformation into something requiring Graham's destruction so revealing about the specific character of the power that Caesar had constructed and what it required for its maintenance. The First Battle of Hoover Dam was the event that revealed the limits of what the Legion's military machine, the machine that Graham had built and commanded, could accomplish against a specific kind of organized resistance, at a specific kind of defensive position. And the defeat at that battle was a defeat that the Legion's institutional identity was not designed to accommodate without consequences, whose distribution, the institution's framework, inevitably organized around the person most immediately responsible for the outcome. Caesar's legion had been built around the myth of its invincibility, the sustained demonstration of military superiority that had been the practical mechanism of its territorial expansion and the ideological foundation of Caesar's authority within it. A defeat could not simply be absorbed as one outcome among many within a framework organized around the impossibility of defeat. It required an explanation, and the explanation the framework was structured to produce was an explanation that preserved the institution at the cost of the person whose performance was most directly available to bear the weight of what needed to be explained away. Graham was wrapped in pitch and set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon with the specific calculation of someone who had determined that this particular person needed to be destroyed in a way that was demonstrably thorough, that could not be undermined by subsequent uncertainty about whether the destruction had actually been accomplished. Caesar knew what Graham was capable of in the specific and comprehensive way that you know the capabilities of the person you have spent years working alongside in the closest operational proximity, and the specific manner of the execution reflected that knowledge. Fire and a canyon together, in the specific logic of Caesar's calculation, constituted a combination that even Graham's extraordinary physical resilience could not survive. The calculation was wrong. The wrongness of the calculation is itself one of the more significant facts about Joshua Graham, about what he was, and what the subsequent history of his survival made possible, and what the world that attempted his destruction eventually had to reckon with. He climbed out of the canyon, burned, broken, transformed, in ways that no one who had not undergone the same experience could fully account for. He climbed out. And what climbed out was something the wasteland had no adequate story for, because the stories it had were stories about the Malpais legate, about who he had been before the fire, and those stories did not have adequate categories for the person, the fire, and the canyon, and the long, painful return from. Both had produced. The legend that grew up around the burned man in the years between the First Battle of Hoover Dam and the events of Honest Hearts is one of the wasteland's more instructive examples of how genuine events become mythology through the specific mechanisms of distance and fear, and the particular human need to give shape and containable form to things whose actual character resists containment. The legend was not managed or designed. No single institutional actor sat down and decided what the burned man story should be, and then propagated that version through deliberate channels. It grew the way legends grow, which is to say, organically and inconsistently, and with the specific distortions that each retelling introduces, when the person retelling the story is working from incomplete information about events they did not witness and are filling the gaps with the logic of their own fears and their own needs. The result was not a single coherent mythology, but a family of related stories sharing certain central facts: the pitch, the fire, the canyon, and diverging substantially in everything they built around those facts, diverging in ways whose specific directions revealed as much about the communities doing the building as about the event and the person the building was organized around. The central fact that all versions of the legend shared was the survival itself, and the survival's impossibility was the engine that drove the mythology's various elaborations. A person wrapped in pitch and set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon should not survive. The combination of variables, the burns, the fall, the canyon's remoteness, the practical impossibility of finding water or food or medical attention in the immediate aftermath of such an experience constituted a situation whose physical logic pointed in one direction only, and that direction was not survival. The fact that Graham had nonetheless survived was therefore a fact that required explanation in every community that encountered it. And the explanations those communities developed were explanations organized around whatever frameworks they possessed for accounting for the impossible. The Legion explained it through the specific and deeply uncomfortable lens of a fear that Caesar's institutional management of the story was designed to channel and contain the burned man had survived, because his hatred was sufficient to sustain him past the point where ordinary human beings would have died, which was an explanation that kept the survival within the territory of comprehensible, if extreme, human motivation, while acknowledging that its extremity put it outside the range of normal human experience. The NCR explained it through the practical military register of an organization that had learned to take the Legion's capabilities seriously. The burned man had survived because the Legion's most effective military commander was constitutionally capable of surviving things that would kill anyone else, which was an explanation that served the NCR's institutional interest in taking seriously the possibility of his return without requiring them to engage with the more difficult dimensions of what the survival actually meant. The tribal communities of the Mojave and the surrounding territories developed their own explanations, shaped by their specific cultural frameworks and their specific relationships to the history the burned man's story was embedded in. And these explanations ranged from the straightforwardly supernatural to the more pragmatically evaluative, but they shared with the other versions the specific quality of reaching for frameworks adequate to an event whose character exceeded the frameworks available to the communities constructing the explanations. Caesar's relationship to the legend he had created by creating the conditions for its central event was one of the more psychologically revealing aspects of his documented character, and it reveals something about the specific form of power he had constructed and what that form of power required for its maintenance. He had attempted to destroy Graham with a thoroughness designed to eliminate the possibility of subsequent uncertainty about the outcome, and the subsequent uncertainty that had developed anyway, the persistent question of whether Graham had actually survived, which the absence of a confirmed body and the absence of confirmed death made permanently available as a question, was a form of uncertainty that Caesar's institutional framework was not designed to accommodate comfortably. The burned man as a confirmed dead man was a story Caesar could manage, the failed commander executed for his failure, the Legion's institutional narrative of invincibility preserved through the reassignment of responsibility for the defeat. The burned man as a possibly surviving entity operating somewhere in the territories beyond Caesar's direct control was a different story entirely, and the specific way that Caesar managed the shift from the first story to the second, maintaining the burned man's legendary status while declining to confirm either his death or his survival, was itself a form of management whose specific character reflected Caesar's understanding that the legend was more controllable than the man, and that the ambiguity of the man's fate was less threatening to the institution than either clear option would have been. The new California Republic's engagement with the burned man legend was organized around a different set of institutional needs than Caesar's, and the specific version of the legend the NCR developed reflected the specific anxieties and the specific military priorities of an organization that had its own complicated history with the First Battle of Hoover Dam and with the military performance that the burned man's defeat had interrupted. For the NCR, the burned man's potential survival was a tactical problem, the possible return to active military operations of the most effective commander the Legion had fielded, potentially freed from the institutional constraints that had governed his conduct within the Legion, and potentially motivated by the specific and focused anger of someone who had been attempted to be destroyed by the people who had previously relied on him. The NCR's military planning apparatus had developed contingency frameworks organized around the assumption that the burned man might be real and might eventually reappear in a form that required operational response. And the specific character of those frameworks reflected the NCR's assessment of what Graham's particular combination of capabilities would look like if deployed against them in circumstances that the Legion's institutional hierarchy no longer constrained. The frameworks were not comforting. The tribal communities whose territories had been affected by the Legion's campaigns of expansion, the communities that had been absorbed or displaced or destroyed by the military force that Graham had built and commanded, had developed their own relationships to the burned man legend that were shaped by their specific experiences of what the Malpais legate's capabilities had meant in the most direct and immediate terms of their own communities' histories. For those communities, the legend was not primarily a military or political problem, but something closer to a moral and cosmological one, a question about what the survival of the person most responsible for specific and remembered harms meant for the mass, specific moral accounting that those harms demanded. The various answers those communities developed were as diverse as their specific histories and their specific cultural frameworks, and they ranged from the straightforwardly hostile the burned man had survived because the world was not done with him, and the way the world was not done with him was the way it eventually collected what was owed to it, to something more complicated and more interesting. A reading of the survival as a form of cosmic suspension, whose resolution in one direction or another remained to be determined by what the burned man eventually chose to do with the survival he had been impossibly granted. What every version of the legend shared, across the diversity of the communities producing them and the diversity of the frameworks organizing their specific elaborations, was an inability to accommodate the actual person that the survival had produced, the specific man who had climbed out of the canyon and who was, in the years between the canyon and the Honest Hearts events, inhabiting a life in Zion Canyon that bore limited relationship to the figure of any of the version's imaginations. The legends were constructed around the Malpais legate, around the capabilities and the motivations, and the specific character of the military commander who had been thrown into the canyon, because those were the only materials the legend makers had available to construct their accounts from. The transformation that the canyon and the years since had worked on the person those capabilities and motivations had previously organized was not a transformation that the legends had any mechanism for anticipating or incorporating, because the transformation had occurred out of sight of everyone who was doing the constructing, in a place and through a process that none of the legend-making communities had access to. The burned man of the wasteland's collective imagination was a fixed figure the Malpais legate extended forward into a hypothetical future by the logic of what the Malpais legate had been, and the gap between that fixed figure and the actual person living in Zion Canyon was one of the more significant and most consistently overlooked gaps in the wasteland's understanding of its own recent history. The specific landscape of Zion Canyon is something that the wasteland's various accounts of Joshua Graham have never fully reckoned with, because the accounts tend to be accounts of a person, and to treat the landscape as background rather than as a participant in the story it is providing the setting for. But Zion Canyon was not simply the place where Graham happened to end up after the canyon and the years of wandering that followed it. It was a specific environment whose specific character shaped what was possible for him in ways that are not separable from the story of what he eventually became within it. And attending to the canyon's specific character is necessary for understanding why the second life took the form it took, rather than some other available form. Zion Canyon, in the post-war period, had experienced something that most of the wasteland had not experienced, something that the combination of the canyon's geological isolation and its distance from the major population, centers that had been the primary targets of the bombing, had made possible. It had recovered, not completely, not without the specific marks that 2 centuries of post-war environmental disruption had left on everything it touched, but substantially and visibly recovered in the specific sense that the ecological systems the canyon had supported before the bombing had continued to function after it, had adapted to the changed conditions with the specific resilience that biological systems demonstrate when the disruption they are exposed to falls within the range their adaptive capacity can address rather than exceeding it. Catastrophically, the canyon had trees, it had running water, it had the specific quality of air that moving water and living trees together produce, a quality whose presence in a landscape was so rare in the post-war world that the people who encountered it for the first time in Zion reported the experience with the specific wonder of people encountering something they had read about in records of the pre-war world and had not expected to find still real in the world they actually inhabited. This environment was the environment in which Graham found himself after the canyon floor and the long recovery that followed it, and the specific effect of that environment on a person whose most recent, sustained experience of landscape had been the specific and unforgiving character of the Mojave was not incidental to the story of what happened to him within it. The canyon's beauty was not the wasteland's characteristic beauty of ruin, not the specific aesthetic that the post-war world had developed around the visual interest of collapse and transformation, and the specific patina that 2 centuries of exposure and weathering gave to the physical evidence of what the pre-war civilization had been. It was an older and more fundamental beauty, the beauty of geological time and hydrological patience, and the specific forms that living systems produce when they are left to develop according to their own logic, without the interruption of catastrophe. Being in the presence of this beauty was not a passive experience for someone with Graham's specific history and his specific relationship to the question of what the world contained that was worth trying to protect, and the canyon's specific character as a place of genuine and largely undamaged natural grandeur was itself a form of argument, a material demonstration available to daily observation of the proposition that something worth protecting still existed and was worth the specific costs that protection imposed. The dead horses were the tribal community whose relationship to Graham developed most directly around the register of martial capability, and their assessment of him was the assessment of people who had learned to evaluate capability through direct observation and who had observed enough of what Graham could do to form a view whose specific character was shaped more by accurate assessment than by the mythology that the wasteland at large had developed around the burned man figure. They were not unaware of the mythology the burned man's story had reached the canyon's communities in forms that the canyon's relative isolation had filtered but not entirely excluded, but their engagement with power. Graham was an engagement with the actual person rather than with the legend, because the actual person was present in the canyon and the legend was not, and the specific forms of competence the actual person demonstrated were forms that the dead horse's own martial culture equipped them to evaluate with a precision that the legend makers had not been capable of developing from their greater distances. The dead horse's adoption of Graham was, as the outline's account of their relationship suggests, a calculation, the specific calculation of a community that had assessed the threat the white legs represented and had concluded that the threat exceeded their own defensive capabilities in ways that the presence of someone with Graham's specific knowledge and skills could meaningfully address. But it would be a misreading of that calculation to understand it as purely instrumental as the simple recognition that Graham was useful and nothing else. Communities that accept into genuine membership someone with the specific history that Graham carried do not do so purely instrumentally, because the specific history he carried was a history whose implications for what he was and what he was capable of were not lost on the people accepting him. The dead horses knew what they were accepting when they accepted Graham, and the specific quality of what they extended to him, which was not simply toleration or utilization, but something closer to recognition. The recognition that he was genuinely trying to be what he was presenting himself as, trying to be reflected, their assessment, not just of his capabilities, but of the person organizing those capabilities toward the specific purposes. His presence in the canyon was organized around. The Sorrow's relationship to Graham was organized around different registers than the dead horses, and the difference is itself informative about the specific complexity of what Graham was attempting to be in Zion Canyon, where the dead horses engaged with him primarily through the martial framework that their own cultural identity emphasized. The Sorrows engaged with him through a different set of concerns organized more around the pastoral and spiritual dimensions of the new Canaanite missionary tradition that Daniel was practicing among them, and that Graham's own return to faith had reconnected him to, in the specific and complicated form that a return across the full distance of his particular history made possible. The Sorrows knew Daniel well, and knew Daniel's approach, the patient pastoral presence, the genuine engagement with their specific cultural life. The consistent demonstration that care for their welfare was not a strategy, but a commitment, and their relationship to Graham was inevitably shaped by the comparison that the presence of both men in the canyon made available. Graham was not Daniel. He was something more complicated than Daniel, something that the Sorrows' engagement with him through the framework Daniel's presence had established required them to account for, in terms that their existing frameworks did not entirely provide. What the canyon asked of Graham that no other place had was the specific and demanding thing it asks of anyone who tries to inhabit it genuinely, rather than simply occupy it, the requirement of presence in the full and unmanaged sense that presence means when it is not organized around operational objectives that can be specified in advance and achieved through specific sequences of action. Graham's previous life had been organized around operational objectives, the mission, the campaign, the specific military project whose demands provided a framework within which his capabilities found their direction and their application. Zion Canyon provided no such framework. The demands it made were the demands of specific people in specific circumstances whose needs could not be anticipated and whose claims on Graham could not be managed through the operational frameworks his military career had developed. People needed things from him that his training had not prepared him to provide: comfort, guidance, the specific and patient forms of attention that the pastoral tradition he had returned to required of its practitioners. And the gap between what was needed and what his specific history had equipped him to provide was a gap whose navigation constituted a significant portion of the daily reality of his life in the canyon. The years that passed between the canyon floor and the Honest Hearts events were years in which Graham was doing something that the wasteland's various accounts of him had not developed adequate categories for recognizing as the significant achievement. It was the specific and daily work of maintaining a commitment to a different way of being in the world than the one his previous life had established as his default. In circumstances that made the maintenance both necessary and difficult, and whose specific demands continued to evolve in ways that the commitment had to adapt to rather than simply sustain. He was not a reformed person in the sense that the redemption narrative typically employs a person who had been bad and was now good, the transformation complete, and the previous identity replaced by a new one that bore only residual marks of what had preceded it. He was a person who had been specific things and who was trying, in the specific and ongoing and imperfect way that trying actually works, to be different things in the same life and the same body and the same history that the previous things had produced. And the trying was itself the achievement rather than the precondition of some cleaner resolution that never quite arrived. The faith that Joshua Graham returned to after the canyon and the years of wandering that followed it was not the same faith he had carried when he left the new Canaanite community to follow Edward Sallow into the project that became Caesar's Legion. And the difference between the faith he had left and the faith he returned to is not adequately captured by any account that treats the return as a simple resumption, as though the faith had been set down and could be picked up again, in exactly the form and condition in which it had been left. The faith he returned to was the faith of a person who had done what he had done and survived what he had survived, and who was returning to a tradition that had not been designed, in its original elaboration, to accommodate the specific combination of experiences he was bringing to the return. The tradition could accommodate him. The new Canaanite framework was sufficiently deep and sufficiently flexible in its theological resources to engage with the specific forms of experience and the specific moral weight that Graham was carrying. But the accommodation required genuine engagement with the difficulty rather than the pretense that the difficulty was not there. And the specific form of the faith Graham inhabited in Zion Canyon was a faith shaped by that genuine engagement in ways that distinguished it from the faith of people whose relationship to the tradition had not been tested across anything comparable to the distance Graham had traveled. His understanding of his own survival was the center of the theological account he had developed, and it was an understanding whose specific character is worth examining with the seriousness he brought to it, rather than reducing to either the convenient language of gratitude, the survivor who is simply thankful to have been spared, or the equally convenient language of burden, the survivor who is crushed by the weight of what the sparing obligates. Graham was neither simply grateful nor simply burdened, and his accounts of his relationship to the survival reflect something more complex and more honest than either of those available simplifications. He understood his survival as something that had been permitted as an outcome, that a God whose reality he understood the survival to be evidence of had allowed to occur when the physics of what had been done to him pointed clearly in the other direction, and this understanding carried with it the specific theological implication that the permitting was not arbitrary, that survival in such circumstances was survival for something rather than survival as a merely neutral continuation of biological existence. He was trying to discern what the something was, and the discernment was an ongoing process rather than a completed conclusion, organized around the specific circumstances of his daily life in the canyon, and the specific demands those circumstances placed on his understanding of what he was supposed to be doing with the survival he had been given. The specific theological positions that Graham's various conversations in Zion Canyon document him articulating are notable for a quality that the wasteland's broader theological landscape does not often produce: genuine, intellectual honesty about the specific tensions that the positions he held created for each other, and genuine refusal to resolve those tensions through the various available mechanisms of self-exculpation or comfortable narrative. He was frank about the violence he had done in the Legion years in a way that most people who had done comparable violence within religious frameworks had not been frank about its scale, its systematic character, its relationship to his own capabilities and his own choices, its distance from the specific values of the faith he now professed. He did not use the faith to explain the violence as having served some larger purpose whose goodness justified its methods. He did not use the survival to position the violence as a necessary cost of a journey towards something that made the cost retrospectively meaningful. He held the violence in direct view and maintained alongside it, in the same account of who he was, the genuine faith he now professed, refusing the resolution of either element at the cost of the other, and maintaining the tension between them as an honest representation of his actual situation, rather than a rhetorical position he was maintaining for the benefit of an audience. The specific question of mercy and justice that organized much of Graham's theological engagement in Zion Canyon was a question that his particular history gave him specific and unavoidable reasons to take seriously. The tradition he had returned to had resources for engaging with this question had developed across its long history of operating in circumstances where the simple application of either principle without the other produced outcomes, whose inadequacy was visible in the specific suffering of specific people. A sophisticated set of frameworks for thinking about the relationship between what mercy required and what justice demanded in specific situations involving specific people. Graham engaged with these resources with the specific urgency of someone for whom the question was not theoretical but immediately and practically relevant to the decisions he was being asked to make about specific people in specific circumstances. And the engagement produced not a clean resolution, but a working understanding, a set of practical conclusions about specific situations that he held with awareness of their incompleteness and their susceptibility to revision rather than with the confidence of someone who had arrived at a settled position. The anger that remained in him after the canyon, and after the years in the canyon, the specific capacity for violence, whose cultivation across the Legion years had produced a person capable of things that the person he was trying to become would not choose to do, was one of the dimensions of his theological and psychological self-understanding that he engaged with most directly and most honestly. He did not present himself as a person who had been healed of his anger by his faith or his suffering, or the specific quality of the life the canyon had provided. He presented himself as a person who was in an ongoing and not consistently successful relationship with an anger that was real and that his history had made powerful, and that his faith required him to manage without requiring him to pretend that the management was complete or that the anger itself was no longer present. The specific honesty of this presentation is one of the things that distinguishes Graham's theological self-account from the more comfortable versions of the same basic story that the Wastelands' various redemption narratives had available as templates. Daniel's presence in Zion Canyon provided the specific counterpoint that Graham's theological position required to be properly understood, because Daniel represented within the same tradition a different but equally genuine conclusion about what the tradition demanded in circumstances of threat and violence. And the argument between them was the argument between two people who shared a framework and who had arrived through different experiences and different temperaments at different understandings of what the framework required in the specific situation they were both inhabiting. Daniel's commitment to non-violent engagement, his conviction that the sorrow's evacuation was the response most consistent with genuine care for their welfare, was not a position he held timidly or apologetically, but one he defended with the specific and confident engagement of someone who had thought about it seriously and who understood the costs of the position he was taking, as well as the costs of the position he was declining to take. The argument between Graham and Daniel was therefore not the argument between a thoughtful position and a thoughtless one, or between a realistic position and an idealistic one, but between two thoughtful positions whose genuine difference was the genuine theological disagreement of two people who had access to the same tradition and who understood it differently in the most fundamental and consequential ways. The Whitelegs were not simply a tribal group with territorial ambitions that had happened to come into conflict with the communities of Zion Canyon through the ordinary mechanisms of post-war resource competition and the various forms of violence that such competition reliably produces. They were something more specifically dangerous than that, and understanding what made them specifically dangerous requires understanding the institutional context that had shaped their development, and that was, at the time of the Honest Hearts events, organizing their campaign against the canyon in ways that went considerably beyond anything that an independent tribal conflict would have produced. Caesar had used the Whitelegs as an instrument, had identified the destruction of New Canaan as an objective whose achievement would serve the Legion's interests in the specific form of eliminating a source of ideological resistance to Legion expansion, and whose execution he had determined the Whitelegs could accomplish with sufficient guidance and sufficient supply from Legion sources, and the relationship between the Whitelegs and the Legion that this use had established had transformed the tribal group from a regional presence of limited strategic significance into something considerably more threatening, equipped with weapons and tactical knowledge whose sources in the Legion's supply networks gave them advantages that the canyon's own communities could not match through their own resources. The specific character of the threat the Whitelegs represented was therefore not merely a matter of numbers or of individual martial capability, but of the institutional backing that the Legion's patronage had provided, the backing that had given them access to weapons and supplies whose availability in the specific quantities and at the specific consistency the Whitelegs had demonstrated reflected a supply relationship that a purely tribal operation could not have maintained. The dead horses and the sorrows were communities whose existence in the canyon had equipped them with the specific forms of knowledge and capability that the canyon's specific environment required: knowledge of the terrain, capability for the specific forms of movement and engagement that the canyon's geography made most effective. But neither the terrain knowledge nor the martial capability had been sufficient to prevent the Whitelegs from maintaining a campaign of pressure against the canyon's communities that had been escalating in intensity and in cost across the period immediately preceding the arrival of the Happy Trails caravan. Graham understood what he was looking at when he assessed the military situation the canyon faced, and what he was looking at was a problem whose trajectory, without significant intervention in the variables that were driving it, pointed toward outcomes that the communities he had accepted responsibility for protecting could not survive. The arrival of the Happy Trails caravan's surviving members, the courier among them, changed the equation in ways that Graham recognized with the speed of someone whose decades of military experience had trained him to read the specific character of changed situations rapidly, and to understand what the changes meant for the practical possibilities available within them. The courier represented a specific addition of capability that the existing balance of the conflict had not contained, and Graham's assessment of what that capability made possible was an assessment conducted not in the abstract terms of tactical planning, but in the immediate and specific terms of the situation the canyon was actually facing, and the specific interventions that the situation actually required. He was not a person who developed plans for contingencies he had not yet encountered. He was a person who read what was in front of him and determined what the reading required. And what the reading of the honest heart situation required was a response whose character, the arrival of the courier, made viable in ways it had not been before. His conduct of the campaign against the Whitelegs was the conduct of someone who had not lost the military capabilities that the Legion years had developed, whose understanding of engagement and terrain and the specific forms of psychological pressure that sustained military operations impose on the people subjected to them was as precise and as practically effective as it had been in the years when he had commanded the Legion's forces across the full range of their expansion campaigns. The tactics he employed in Zion Canyon were the tactics of a person who understood violence with the specific and comprehensive understanding of someone who had spent the defining years of their professional life learning to use it effectively, and the application of that understanding to the defense of the canyon's communities was an application whose effectiveness was visible in the specific outcomes the campaign produced. He was still what the Legion years had made him capable of being, in the most operationally precise sense of that statement, and the canyon's crisis forced the expression of that capability in ways that the more pastoral dimensions of his canyon life had allowed him to manage rather than fully express. The specific question of proportionality of whether the degree of violence Graham was willing to pursue against the Whitelegs exceeded what pure tactical necessity required, and what the excess meant for the moral character of the campaign he was conducting, was a question that the canonical encounters in Honest Hearts engage with directly, rather than resolving it through the convenient narrative of the compass, justified warrior whose conduct is organized entirely by the requirements of the defensive mission. Graham was willing to destroy the Whitelegs with a completeness that his own accounts of the situation acknowledged went beyond what the strict logic of defending the canyon demanded. And the specific reasons he gave for that willingness were reasons whose honesty is part of what makes them significant. The Whitelegs had destroyed New Canaan. They had killed people whose specific names and specific faces and specific relationships to Graham constituted the living content of what the destruction of New Canaan had meant in the most immediate and personal terms of his own experience. The anger that remained in him from the canyon and from the years of carrying what the canyon had cost him was not extinguished by the theological framework he had developed for engaging with it. And the Whiteleg's campaign against Zion Canyon gave that anger specific and available objects in ways that the more general conditions of his life in the canyon had not. He was aware of this. One of the more significant aspects of Graham's self-account in the canonical encounters of honest hearts is the specific awareness he demonstrated of the difference between the violence and the tactical situation required, and the free violence his anger was capable of producing, and of the moral risk that the conflation of these two categories represented for the character of what he was doing and for the person doing it. He was not conducting a campaign of pure tactical necessity and understanding it as something else. He was conducting a campaign in which tactical necessity and genuine anger were both present and were not always clearly distinguishable from each other in the specific decisions the campaign required. And his acknowledgement of this ambiguity, his refusal to present the anger as simply the appropriate emotional response to the tactical situation, rather than as a morally significant dimension of his conduct that required its own accounting, was an expression of the specific quality of honest self-examination that his theological framework demanded, and that his character, as the canonical record documents it, was genuinely capable of. The specific moments in the honest heart's encounters that document the courier's observation of Graham in the field, the moments that revealed dimensions of the Malpais legate that the more pastoral and contemplative character of Graham's canyon life had not made visible, are the moments that the legend's various versions had been attempting, through their various elaborations, to anticipate and account for. And their specific character in the canonical record is instructive about the relationship between the legend and the man. The legend had preserved the Malpais legate's capability and projected it forward in time as the primary feature of the burned man's possible future return. What the canonical encounters revealed was that the legend was not wrong about the capability. The capability was genuinely there, operational and precise, and capable of the specific forms of effectiveness that the legend had attributed to it, but that it was inadequate to the person the capability now belonged to, because the person was not the Malpais legate and had not been for years, and the capability's expression in the context of the Honest Hearts campaign was the expression of a different person, using a similar capability in a different direction for different reasons, whose specific character the legend had never developed the resources to anticipate. The resolution of the Whitelegs conflict the specific outcome that the canonical account makes possible through the courier's choices and capabilities was not a clean victory in the sense that the military history of the wasteland tended to understand victories. It resolved the immediate threat. It produced the specific tactical outcomes that the defense of the canyon's communities required. But it was embedded in a context of loss, the prior destruction of New Canaan, the deaths of specific people whose names and faces were part of what the destruction had taken, the specific irreversibility of what the Whitelegs' campaign had already accomplished before the conflict's resolution that the resolution could not undo, and whose presence in the background of the victory gave the victory its specific and complicated character. Graham experienced the resolution as someone who understood both what it had accomplished and what it had not been capable of accomplishing, and the specific quality of his relationship to the outcome reflected that understanding. Joshua Graham's self-knowledge was the specific and uncomfortable kind that comes not from deliberate cultivation of introspective practice, but from having been forced, by the extremity of specific experience, to look at what you are, with a clarity that more ordinary circumstances rarely demand. The canyon had forced a form of examination that he had not chosen and could not have anticipated, and the years since the canyon had been years in which the examination had continued, because the circumstances of his life in Zion Canyon, the specific demands of being present with specific people in specific circumstances of ongoing threat and ongoing need, had continued to force the examination, rather than permitting the comfortable accumulation of self-protective narrative that more sheltered circumstances might have allowed. He knew what he had done in the Legion years. He knew it in the specific and detailed way that the person who has done something knows it, with the sensory and moral weight of having been present for it, having made the decisions that produced it, having observed its effects on the people it was done to, rather than in the abstract and distanced way that observers know comparable things from their greater remove. And he engaged with that knowledge in the canonical encounters that Honest Hearts preserves, with a directness whose specific character set him apart from most people in the Wastelands record who had done things of comparable moral weight. The guilt that was and was not present in Graham's self-account was organized differently than the conventional redemption narrative typically expects. Guilt to be organized in accounts of this kind, and the difference is significant rather than incidental. He did not present himself as a person whose dawning awareness of the full moral weight of what he had done had produced the overwhelming and paralyzing grief that the conventional narrative assigns to this stage of the redemptive arc. He was not discovering the horror of what he had done. He had known what he was doing while he was doing it, had understood, with the specific clarity of someone conducting the systematic violence of the Legion's expansion campaigns through 2 decades of operational detail, exactly what his actions were and what they were producing for the people subjected to them. The knowledge had been present throughout. What had changed after the canyon was not the knowledge, but the framework within which the knowledge was being held, the replacement of the Legion's operational framework, within which that knowledge had been managed as a professional reality rather than a moral one, with the new Canaanite theological framework that required the moral dimension of the knowledge to be engaged with rather than managed around. The specific quality of what he felt about what he had done was something he described in the canonical encounters that preserve his self-account, with a precision that resisted the comfortable simplifications available in the language of guilt and remorse and regret. He acknowledged the moral weight of what he had done with genuine seriousness and genuine care. He was not performing equanimity in the face of something that actually disturbed him more than the performance suggested. But what he felt was not primarily the overwhelming grief of someone encountering a moral reality they had previously been protected from, because he had not been protected from it. It was something more complicated, a genuine sorrow that existed alongside a genuine awareness that the sorrow did not alter the outcomes the actions had produced for the people who had borne them, that the moral reality of the actions was not diminished by the sincerity of the feeling with which they were subsequently regarded, and that the specific comfort available in the experience of genuine remorse, the experience of feeling that the feeling itself was somehow addressing the moral debt that the actions had created, was a comfort he was not entitled to, and whose acceptance would itself have been a form of dishonesty about the relationship between his feelings and the people those feelings were ostensibly about. The anger that remained in him was the dimension of his self-description that the canonical encounters engaged with most directly, and the specific honesty of that engagement is one of the more significant aspects of his character as the record documents it. He had been made into a specific kind of person by the specific experiences his life had subjected him to, and the specific kind of person the Legion years had made him capable of being included, a capacity for violence whose depth and precision were not things that faith or suffering or the passage of years had diminished to the point of irrelevance. He knew this about himself with the specific clarity of someone who had recently provided himself with direct evidence of it, whose conduct in the White Legs campaign had demonstrated that the capability was not diminished, and whose awareness of what the conduct had been in its fullest character, including the dimensions of it that exceeded what pure tactical necessity required, was an awareness he was maintaining honestly, rather than managing into a more comfortable narrative about the justified defender, whose anger was simply the appropriate emotional register of the defensive mission. What Graham understood about Caesar, that Caesar had perhaps not fully accounted for in the decision to throw him into the canyon, was the specific and comprehensive form of understanding that comes from having built something with a person in the closest possible operational proximity across a period of years. The understanding that is organized not around the public persona the person presents to the world, but around the specific character of the person's actual operation, the specific mechanisms of their thinking and their motivation and their relationship to the institution they have built and the uses they have made of it. Graham had watched Edward Sallow become Caesar across the full span of the becoming, from the scholar with an interesting idea to the institutional deity whose entire existence had been organized around the maintenance of the specific form of authority that the deity construct required. He understood the vulnerabilities that the construct concealed, the specific ways that Caesar's institutional identity was more fragile than its surface performance of invincibility suggested, the specific dependencies that the legion's coherence had on the specific person at its center, rather than on the institutional principles the person claimed to embody. This understanding was itself a form of the damage that what had been done to him had produced, in the specific sense that surviving something generates knowledge of the person who attempted it, that the person had not intended to provide. The life Graham was trying to construct in Zion Canyon, the specific combination of protective violence and pastoral care and theological engagement that his role within the canyon's communities involved, was not a life he had found preformed and stepped into. It was a life he was building in real time, without a template adequate to the specific combination of things he was. And the building was a process whose genuine difficulties and genuine uncertainties were not concealed by the coherence that the canonical record's presentation of him might suggest to a reader who was not attending to the specific texture of what he was saying about himself. He was not a settled person presenting the results of a completed journey. He was a person in the middle of the journey, whose destination was not clearly visible from where he currently stood, and whose assessment of his own progress was marked by the specific honesty of someone who understood the difference between genuine movement in a direction, performance of movement that left the underlying position unchanged. The specific form of redemption that was available to him was not the form that the conventional narrative typically offers, the form in which the bad person becomes, through the specific mechanism of sufficient suffering and sufficient grace, a good person who has left the bad person behind in a transformation whose completeness is the resolution of the story. That form was not available to Graham, and his theological and psychological self-accounts reflected a genuine understanding of its unavailability rather than a temporary acknowledgement of difficulty that the eventual completion of the journey would subsequently correct. The person he had been in the Legion years, the Malpais legate, the builder of an institution whose methods had organized systematic violence across 2 decades and across the lives of enormous numbers of specific people, was not a person who could be left behind through the mechanism of sufficient suffering, because the specific character of what that person had done was not the kind of thing that the mechanism of personal transformation alone was adequate to address. What was available to him was something more modest and more honest than the conventional redemption narratives offer, the possibility of continuing to try to live differently without the guarantee that the trying was sufficient to the moral weight it was attempting to address, and without the comfort of certainty about whether the specific form of accounting that what he had done required was something that his own efforts, however sustained and however genuine, could provide. The Daniel who inhabited Zion Canyon alongside Graham was not simply his theological opponent in a debate about tactics or his institutional counterpart in the new Canaanite mission structure that the canyon's 2 surviving missionaries represented. He was the specific person whose presence in the canyon made visible, through the comparison his different approach inevitably invited, the specific dimensions of Graham's own approach, whose character was most difficult to account for, the dimensions that were most clearly shaped by what the Legion years had made of him, rather than by what the faith he had returned to required of him. Daniel was the person Graham might have been if the encounter with Sallow had not occurred, or if it had occurred differently, or if the specific combination of circumstances and choices that had produced the Malpais legate had assembled themselves into a different configuration. This was not a thought that Graham appears to have indulged with any frequency, or with any of the sentimental quality that the what might have been mode of reflection tends to generate in the people who engage with it. But the comparison was structurally present in the situation, and its presence organized certain dimensions of the relationship between the two men that would not have been present if their histories had been more similar. Daniel had built his relationship with the Sorrows across years of patient pastoral engagement, the sustained and genuinely attentive presence that the missionary tradition valued as the most honest demonstration of care for specific people in specific circumstances. The willingness to inhabit the slow and unglamorous work of building trust through consistent attention to the specific needs and the specific lives of the people the attention was directed toward. He had learned the Sorrows' specific ways of organizing the world with the genuine respect that the tradition required of its practitioners, had learned them not as strategic information about how to be more effective in pursuing the mission's objectives, but as the forms of a specific people's specific humanity, deserving of engagement on their own terms, rather than on the terms most convenient to the person engaging with them. The relationship he had built through this process was the relationship of a person who had genuinely tried to see the Sorrows as they were, rather than as the objects of a project whose character was determined in advance of the Sorrows. Engagement, and the specific quality of the trust that relationship had produced, was the trust that genuine seeing, sustained across sufficient time, reliably produces. Graham's relationship with the dead horses was organized around a different kind of engagement, the engagement of a person whose capabilities in the specific register that the dead horses' martial culture most valued had been visible from early in his presence in the canyon, and whose willingness to deploy those capabilities in service of the canyon's communities had been demonstrated across the years in ways that the community had been able to observe and assess. The trust the dead horses extended to Graham was the trust of a martial community extending recognition to someone whose capabilities they understood and whose deployment of those capabilities they had found to be organized around the specific commitment to their welfare that justified the recognition. It was a real trust, organized around real observation of real conduct, and it was not diminished by the specific character of what it was organized around the martial capabilities, whose deployment in service of the community's defense was the primary form in which Graham's presence in the Thalawates Canyon made itself felt for the dead horses. The specific disagreement between Graham and Daniel about what the situation in Zion Canyon required was not simply a tactical disagreement between two reasonable people who had assessed the same military situation and arrived at different conclusions about the optimal response. It was a disagreement whose roots went deeper than tactics, went into the specific and fundamental question of what genuine care for specific people in specific circumstances of genuine danger actually meant, and what the tradition they shared required of people committed to that care when the circumstances demanded a response that the tradition's various strands evaluated differently. Daniel's position was that the evacuation of the Sorrows, the movement of the community, away from the specific place where the threat was concentrated and toward a region where they could rebuild their lives outside its reach, was the response most consistent with genuine care for their welfare, because the alternative of standing and fighting imposed on the Sorrows a specific and ongoing relationship to violence, whose costs for their communal life and their specific cultural forms were costs that their continued survival in Zion, even in safety, would not justify. He was not indifferent to the cost of the evacuation, not unaware of what the loss of the specific place that had shaped the Sorrows' specific identity represented for a community whose relationship to that place was embedded in the most fundamental dimensions of their self-understanding. He was arguing that the cost of staying and fighting was higher, for reasons whose character was not primarily military but moral and cultural. Graham's counter-argument was an argument whose force derived from a different understanding of what genuine care for specific people in specific circumstances required, and whose specific character reflected both the theological framework he was operating within and the practical military assessment he had developed of what the situation actually contained and where its various possible trajectories led. He argued that the willingness to stand between people and the thing threatening them was itself a form of the love that the tradition required its practitioners to demonstrate, that the choice to fight for specific people in a forwarding double specific place was a declaration about the value of those people and the seriousness with which that value was being taken, a declaration that the alternative of evacuation, whatever its merits as a practical strategy for the preservation of the community's physical existence, could not make in the same terms. He was not indifferent to the costs of fighting, not unaware of what the engagement with the Whitelegs would require of the canyon's communities in terms of the specific forms of violence that defensive warfare imposed. He was arguing that the alternative of departure left the communities without the specific form of protection that their situation required, and that his capabilities, deployed in their service, could provide, and that the withholding of that protection in favor of the cleaner moral position of non-engagement was itself a choice whose costs for the specific people most immediately affected had to be part of the calculation. The argument between them was the argument at the heart of the honest heart's narrative and its specific character, the genuine force of both positions, the genuine theological depth from which both men were arguing, the genuine commitment to the welfare of the specific people at the center of the disagreement that both men were demonstrating in their different ways, made it a different kind of argument than the simple conflict between pragmatic force and principled non-violence that a less careful account of the situation might have substituted for it. Neither man was wrong in any simple sense, and neither position could be reduced to the other's characterization of it without losing something essential about what the position actually was and why the person holding it held it. The sorrow's own voices and the sorrow's own choices were not irrelevant to the resolution of the argument were, in the canonical account's treatment of the situation, genuinely consequential in ways that the argument's terms, conducted as it sometimes was, over and around the people most directly affected, did not always make fully visible. But the argument itself, in its specific theological and moral dimensions, was the kind of argument that neither a tactical calculation nor a simple appeal to principle could resolve, because it was an argument about what genuine care required in specific circumstances, where reasonable and committed people, sharing a tradition and sharing a commitment to the welfare of the same specific people, had arrived at genuinely different conclusions about what the tradition and the commitment demanded. New Canaan was not simply the place where Joshua Graham had been born and formed and sent out into the world with the capabilities and the commitments that the community's tradition had developed in him across the years of his formation there. It was the specific and irreplaceable thing that the post-war world contained that was most worth trying to recover and rebuild, the thing whose specific character, whose combination of theological seriousness and practical capability and genuine outward-directed care for the people the community encountered in its missionary work, constituted Graham's most fundamental understanding of what a human community could be at its best, and what the effort of living within a tradition of genuine conviction was capable of producing when the tradition was inhabited with the full seriousness and the full commitment that it deserved. He had left it. He had left it not in a single dramatic departure, but by degrees, and through a series of choices whose individual character had not always made their cumulative direction fully visible to the person making them the choice to follow. Sallow into the project that became the Legion, the choices within the Legion's construction and expansion that had each seemed to follow from the previous ones, with a logic that was internally coherent at each individual step, and that only became fully visible as a direction, as a trajectory leading somewhere specific and somewhere distant from the starting point, when the full distance traveled had accumulated into something that could be seen clearly from the outside. He had left it so completely and across such a span of time that the community he had left and the person who had left it had become, across the years of the Malpais legate's existence, things that occupied different registers of his self-understanding, the formation present in the deep background of who he was. The specific foundation on which everything subsequently built had rested without the subsequent building acknowledging the foundation. While the departure was managed through the Legion's institutional framework as a professional reality rather than a moral one, filed in the category of prior associations that had been superseded by present commitments, rather than in the category of things whose weight continued to press against the present from the accumulated distance of the past. The canyon had collapsed the distance between those registers. The canyon and the years of recovery and wandering and eventual arrival in Zion that had followed it had made the formation and the departure and the full weight of what the departure had cost into simultaneous realities rather than sequentially managed ones, had forced them into the same frame of awareness rather than the separate compartments that the Legion's operational culture had made available for their management. The specific form of pain that this simultaneity produced was not a pain that had diminished across the years of his life in Zion Canyon. The formation was present in him as the deepest layer of what he was, the layer on which everything else had been built and from which everything else had departed, and the departure from it was also present, equally real, equally specific in its remembered detail. And the distance between these two things, the thing the formation had made him capable of being, and the thing the departure had made him into, was a distance whose full dimension the canyon had forced him to inhabit without the protective mechanisms his previous life had provided for its management. He lived with this distance daily. He carried it into every interaction with the canyon's communities, into every expression of the care and the commitment and the theological engagement that the second life was organized around. And the carrying was part of the specific weight that the second life imposed on the person attempting it. The destruction of New Canaan by the Whitelegs, organized and supplied by Caesar in the specific execution of a strategic objective whose relationship to Graham's own history was not incidental, but structurally connected to that history in ways whose full dimension Graham understood with the specific and painful clarity of someone who had spent enough time thinking about Caesar's methods to recognize the character of his decisions was the most direct and most irreversible form that the cost of the departure had taken. Caesar had identified New Canaan as a source of ideological resistance to Legion expansion, had understood that the community's specific combination of genuine faith and practical capability and willingness to operate in the Legion's territorial sphere represented a form of presence that the Legion's project of cultural and institutional homogenization could not accommodate without addressing, and had determined that the Whitelegs, sufficiently armed and sufficiently directed through the specific forms of guidance that Legion patronage could provide, were the instrument adequate to the addressing. The specific logic connecting the destruction of New Canaan to the prior attempted destruction of Joshua Graham, the logic by which Caesar's effort to eliminate the burned man through the canyon and his subsequent use of the crave, Whitelegs to eliminate the community that had produced the burned man, were connected as related expressions of the same institutional calculation, as sequential moves in the same strategic project of eliminating the specific human material most resistant to the Legion's total claims. Was not a logic that Graham was protected from understanding. He understood it with the full weight of the understanding available to someone who had been on both sides of Caesar's strategic planning, who had participated in the development of the methods now being directed against the community that had formed him, and who had subsequently become the target of those same methods in their most extreme expression. The connection was visible, and he held it visible, rather than managing it into a frame that would have made it easier to carry. The specific people who had been killed in the destruction of New Canaan were not abstractions for Graham in the way that large-scale losses necessarily become abstractions for people who did not know the individuals the losses took, and who must therefore process the losses through the available mechanisms of aggregation and statistical representation. He had known the community's members across the full span of his formation within it. He had known them with the specific and detailed intimacy of someone who had grown up within a small community where the knowledge of specific individuals' characters and histories and particular forms of capability and specific relationships to the shared tradition was not a luxury, but a practical requirement of the communal life the community organized itself around. He knew which of the community's members had been most gifted at the linguistic work the tradition valued and in which languages their gifts had been expressed, knew which had been most effective at the specific forms of practical care, medical, agricultural, logistical, that the missionary work in difficult environments required of the people undertaking it, knew the specific dimensions of each person's relationship to the faith they shared, and the specific ways different members inhabited the tradition differently and brought different things to its ongoing life, making the community more than the sum of its individual members through the specific combination of their diverse gifts applied to the shared project of living seriously within a common commitment. The destruction of New Canaan was therefore not the destruction of an institution in the abstract, not the elimination of an organizational entity that could in principle be rebuilt under a different name, in a different location, with a different membership, if the institutional forms and the institutional knowledge were preserved. Elsewhere, it was the destruction of all of that specific and particular human reality, the permanent elimination of the specific individuals whose existence had been the living content of what the community was, whose relationships to each other and to the tradition and to the people they had served in their missionary work constituted the actual substance of the institution, rather than its formal structure and the specific weight of each. Specific loss was a weight that Graham carried with the particular heaviness of someone who knew what specifically had been taken and who could not process the taking through the relatively more manageable mechanism of grieving the general category rather than the particular instances. The dimension of Graham's relationship to the destruction of New Canaan that went beyond the ordinary grief of irreversible loss, the dimension whose specific character distinguished it from the grief that any person might feel. For the violent destruction of a community they had valued was the dimension organized around the honest recognition of the connection between the destruction and his own prior history. He held, with the specific and uncomfortable honesty that his faith required of him in all matters touching the relationship between his own choices and the world's outcomes, the recognition that the conditions making the destruction possible were conditions that his prior choices had contributed to producing. This was not causal guilt in the simple and direct sense that requires a person to have chosen the outcome. They are accounting for their role in producing. Graham had not chosen the destruction of New Canaan and would not have chosen it, would have done whatever was available to him to prevent it if he had possessed the capability to prevent it at the time it occurred. But it was a form of moral accountability whose specific character was organized around the understanding that the world's outcomes are not entirely separable from the histories of the people who have been present in the world, in the mark, relationships, and the roles and the institutional capacities that produce the conditions for those outcomes, and that the honest accounting of one's relationship to specific outcomes required the acknowledgement of that connection, rather than its management into a narrative frame whose terms provided protection from its specific weight. Caesar had destroyed New Canaan partly because New Canaan had produced Joshua Graham, and partly because Graham had subsequently built the military instrument that Caesar directed. And the specific connection between those facts and the destruction of the community that had formed Graham was a connection whose moral dimension he was required by his own standards of honesty to acknowledge rather than to bracket as irrelevant to his own accounting. What Graham was attempting in Zion Canyon, the daily practice of caring for the dead horses and the sorrows, with the attention and the capability and the commitment that his tradition required. The deployment of everything he was and everything he could do in service of their welfare and their protection was not simply a personal, ethical practice undertaken for reasons of individual moral development or spiritual growth. It was, in its deepest and most essential character, a form of continuation, the specific and imperfect and profoundly limited form of continuation available to a person in his circumstances of what New Canaan had been and what New Canaan had stood for and what New Canaan had been destroyed for standing for. He was not rebuilding New Canaan. The specific people who had made New Canaan what it was could not be rebuilt, and the community they had constituted could not be reconstituted without them, because communities are not their institutional forms, but their living members, and the living members were gone. What he was doing was something more modest and more real than rebuilding he was inhabiting, in the specific and imperfect way that a person inhabits anything across the full weight of their particular history, the tradition that New Canaan had expressed, keeping it alive in the one form that his specific circumstances made available, which was the form of his own daily practice of it, in the context of the lives and the needs of the specific people the canyon had made his responsibility. The continuation was not adequate to the loss. Nothing could be adequate to the loss, but the continuation was real, and the reality of it was the specific form of refusal available to him, the refusal to permit the loss to be total, to permit the extinction of what had been destroyed to extend into the territory of the living tradition that the destroyed community had carried, to allow Caesar's elimination of the community to constitute the elimination of what the community had been attempting to express in the world. The absence of New Canaan was a permanent feature of Graham's landscape and a permanent feature of the moral context within which everything he did in Zion Canyon had to be understood. It was not the temporary absence of something that might eventually be rebuilt in a form adequate to what had been lost, not the kind of absence that permits the person experiencing it to organize their relationship to it around the farther absence, expectation of eventual resolution. It was the permanent and irreversible absence of something specific and irreplaceable, present in Graham's awareness as a negative space, whose shape was defined with the specific precision of his detailed knowledge of what it had contained, and whose permanence was itself a form of pressure on the ongoing attempt to continue what had been destroyed in the only form the continuation could take. He did not perform the grief of this absence for the benefit of the people around him, and the canonical encounters that preserve his voice in the honest heart's narrative are not primarily organized around the public expression of that grief in forms that would have required his interlocutors to receive and respond to it as grief, but the absence was present in everything he said and everything he did present as the specific weight that made the continuation urgent rather than optional, made the daily practice of the tradition's requirements a moral necessity rather than a personal preference, gave to the protection of the canyon's communities a dimension of meaning that extended beyond the immediate tactical and pastoral justifications for the protection, and into the deeper territory of what the protection was, a continuation of, and what its failure would mean for the ongoing life of the thing the destruction of New Canaan had attempted to end. The arrival of the Happy Trails caravan's surviving members in Zion Canyon brought with it something that the years of Graham's life in the canyon had not previously contained in any sustained form: the presence of people from the broader wasteland, whose relationship to him was organized not through the specific and gradually developed forms of knowledge and trust that the canyon's communities had built across years of direct engagement with the actual person, but through the prior knowledge of the burned man legend that the wasteland at large had produced, and that any visitor from the outside brought into the canyon as part of their existing understanding of the world they were navigating. The courier was the specific instance of this presence whose significance for Graham went beyond the specific addition of military capability that the tactical situation made welcome went into the specific and more complicated territory of what it meant to be encountered by someone whose initial understanding of who Graham was had been organized by a legend whose relationship to the actual person was the relationship of an external construction to the reality it was attempting to account for without adequate access to that reality's actual character. Graham was aware of the legend, and aware of what the legend contained, and aware of the specific ways in which the legend's account of him was both partially accurate and fundamentally incomplete, accurate in its preservation of the Malpais legate's capabilities and the general outline of the events that had produced the burned man figure, incomplete in everything it had built around those accurate elements, through the specific distortions of fear and distance, and the absence of access to what the canyon years had actually made of the person the legend was describing. His engagement with the courier across the canonical encounters of the Honest Heart's narrative was shaped by this awareness in ways that were visible in the specific quality of what he chose to say and how he chose to say it, the patient and methodical effort to establish the actual terms of who he was and what he was attempting in the canyon, to replace the legendary figure's profile with the more complicated and more honest account that the actual person required, to distinguish between the capabilities the legend had accurately identified and the motivations and the framework within which those capabilities were now being deployed that the legend had no resources for anticipating. The requests Graham made of the courier were requests whose specific character revealed something important about both his understanding of the tactical situation and his understanding of his own limitations within it. The tactical dimension was the most immediately visible he needed capability he did not possess in the specific forms that the courier represented, and the acknowledgement of that need was the acknowledgement of someone who had learned, across the years since the canyon, to assess situations honestly, rather than through the lens of what his own capabilities could address unilaterally. But there was another dimension to the requesting that was less straightforwardly tactical and more revealing of what the canyon years had produced in him, the specific quality of genuine consultation, the willingness to engage with the courier's perspective and judgment as genuinely relevant to the decisions the situation required, rather than simply as a set of capabilities to be deployed in service of conclusions already reached. The Malpais legate had not consulted. The Malpais legate had assessed, determined, and directed. And the operational effectiveness of the Legion's military campaigns had been in significant part the effectiveness of a commander whose judgment was sufficiently reliable and whose authority was sufficiently established that the consultation of other perspectives was more likely to introduce uncertainty than to improve outcomes. Graham in Zion Canyon was different from the Malpais legate in this specific respect, and the difference was not simply a matter of reduced institutional authority requiring the acknowledgement of dependence on others' contributions. It was a genuine change in the mode of operation, a genuine opening toward the possibility that other perspectives on the situation might contain things his own did not, that the specific combination of what he could see from where he stood and what the courier could see from where they stood might together constitute a more complete picture of what the situation actually contained than either could achieve independently. The various resolutions of the Honest Heart's narrative, the range of outcomes whose specific character depended on the specific constellation of choices the courier made across the events the narrative contained, from the fullest military engagement with the Whitelegs, through the evacuation of the Sorrows, to the various combinations whose intermediate character reflected the specific tensions the narrative had been building, each represented a different resolution of the specific moral and tactical questions the situation had been raising, and Graham's relationship to each possible outcome was shaped by his honest and detailed understanding of what each resolution would mean for the specific people whose welfare he had accepted responsibility for, and whose futures the resolution would determine. He had genuine and considered preferences among the possible outcomes, preferences whose specific character the canonical encounters document with enough detail to assess, and whose basis in both his theological framework and his tactical understanding of the situation was visible in the reasoning he provided for them. But the preferences were not absolute requirements in the sense of demands that the courier implement them, regardless of the courier's own assessment and the courier's own moral framework. They were the considered conclusions of a person who knew the situation with the specific depth of years of direct engagement, and who was offering that knowledge in service of a decision whose ultimate authority he understood to belong to. The courier, rather than to himself, offering it honestly, without the pretense that the preferences were not preferences, or that his specific history and specific commitments had not shaped them, but also without the insistence that the shaping of his preferences by his history and commitments made those preferences the only legitimate basis for the decision. The encounters in the honest heart's narrative that revealed most completely the dimensions of Graham, that the pastoral and contemplative register of his usual presentation had not fully shown, were the encounters in active conflict, the encounters in which the specific capabilities and the specific relationship to the exercise of those capabilities that the Legion years had developed in him were visible in their fullest operational expression, rather than in the managed and modulated form that the non-operational conditions of his daily canyon life made possible. In those encounters, the person he had been and the person he was trying to become were simultaneously visible in a way that the canyon's ordinary rhythms had not required. The Malpace legate's operational precision and the canyon's pastor's theological engagement present together in the same person, conducting the same activity, neither dominating the other completely, neither resolving the tension between them into the comfortable simplicity of a single coherent identity whose character was entirely determined by one of its components. Graham was aware of what these encounters revealed and engaged with the awareness in his canonical interactions with the courier, with the specific quality of directness that had characterized his self-account throughout the narrative, acknowledging without defensiveness or excessive qualification that what the courier was observing was genuinely and completely part of what he was, that the person who had built the Legion's military capacity had not been superseded by the person inhabiting Zion Canyon, but had been joined by that person in a configuration whose ongoing negotiation was the actual character of his second life, rather than a temporary transitional phase on the way to some cleaner resolution. The meaning of Joshua Graham's story is not a meaning that the Wasteland's available narrative frameworks were adequately equipped to produce from the specific materials the story contained, because the frameworks the Wasteland had developed for accounting for people with histories comparable to Graham's were frameworks organized around simpler trajectories: the bad man who remained bad, the good man who was temporarily corrupted and subsequently reclaimed, the institutional force whose human dimensions were incidental to its functional role in the larger narrative. None of these frameworks was adequate to the specific person the story was actually about, whose character was the specific and irreducible product of everything his history had made him, and everything he was genuinely attempting to be across the full weight of that history, without the simplifying resolution that any of the available frameworks would have required, and that the honest account of his actual situation declined to provide. The question that his story kept raising without resolving was the question of what was genuinely possible for a person who had done what he had done. What forms of continuation were available to someone whose prior actions had been of the specific systematic character and the specific scale that his had been? What honest relationships between past and present self were possible to maintain? What the specific constraints that his specific history imposed on the forms of life he could inhabit, without compromising the honesty that the faith he had returned to required of him as a fundamental condition of inhabiting it at all? The question was not answerable in the abstract, could not be resolved through any general principle about the relationship between prior conduct and subsequent possibility, because its answer depended on specific facts about specific situations that could only be evaluated by the person in the situation, with the full weight of the situation's actual character available to the evaluation. Graham was that person, and his engagement with the question was the engagement of someone doing the evaluation in real time, with the full weight of the situation's actual character fully present in the doing, without the protective distance that more comfortable circumstances might have allowed, without the management mechanisms that the Legion's institutional framework had previously provided, with the specific and demanding honesty that the tradition he had returned to required of him as the fundamental condition of its genuine inhabitation. What his story demonstrated about the limits of the conventional redemption narrative was not a demonstration that redemption was impossible, or that the attempt at genuine transformation was without value, or that the ongoing practice of trying to live differently from the way your history had established as your default was not worth the specific and daily costs the practice imposed. It was a demonstration that the specific form of redemption, the conventional narrative, offered the form in which sufficient suffering was the price of complete transformation, and complete transformation was the resolution of the story, and the resolution was the retroactive justification of everything that had preceded it. Was not a form available to a person whose history had the specific character and the specific scale of his, because the mechanism of personal transformation alone was not adequate to the full moral reality of what his actions had produced, and the full dimension of the accounting that the people who had borne the costs of those actions could reasonably be understood to require. He was genuinely trying. The trying was making a genuine difference to his conduct and his character, and his daily engagement with the people his second life had made his responsibility. But the trying was not the same as the redemption narrative's completion, was not the same as a transformation whose thoroughness was adequate to the full weight of what it was attempting to transform. And the honest engagement with the difference between what the trying was accomplishing and what the full moral reality of the situation required was itself one of the more significant dimensions of what the second life represented. The specific form of hope that his story contained was the form that remained after the conventional redemption narrative's form had been honestly evaluated and honestly found insufficient, the more modest and more demanding form whose character was not the hope of completed transformation, but the hope that the ongoing and uncertain and genuinely costly attempt was not nothing, that its specific value was real even when it was clearly not enough, that the daily practice of genuine trying in the face of everything that made the trying difficult was a form of the moral seriousness that the faith he had returned to required, and whose expression in his daily conduct with the people around him was itself a form of the love the tradition required its practitioners to demonstrate. The hope was not comfortable. It was not the hope that resolved the tension between what he had been and what he was trying to become into a conclusion whose finality permitted relaxation. It was the hope that sustained the ongoing engagement with the tension that made the engagement possible to continue across the years, and the specific demands and the specific failures that the continuing imposed, that gave to the attempt its character as a genuine form of the life the tradition required, rather than a performance of that form organized around the eventual achievement of a completed result. Zion Canyon was the right landscape for this specific story in ways that went beyond the simple fact of its having been the place where the story occurred. The canyon's specific character, its extraordinary preservation of natural beauty in a world organized largely around the aesthetics of destruction and decay, its ongoing testimony to the possibility of recovery and growth, and the development of specific forms of excellence in the aftermath of catastrophe, was not simply a picturesque background for a human story whose meaning was entirely independent of its setting. It was a material argument, present in the daily experience of everyone living within it, for the specific proposition that the story of Graham's second life was organized around demonstrating in human terms the proposition that something worth protecting still existed and was worth the costs that its protection imposed, that recovery across the aftermath of devastation was genuinely possible rather than simply theoretically conceivable, that the specific forms of beauty that careful and sustained attention could develop in specific places and specific people and specific communities were not negated by the fact of what had preceded and surrounded and threatened them, but were made more rather than less significant by the contrast. The canyon was doing, in ecological and geological terms, what Graham was attempting to do in human and moral terms, and the daily encounter with the canyon's evidence of what was possible was itself a form of the argument that the attempt required. The specific texture of what New Canaan had been the daily lived reality of the community, rather than its institutional description or its theological summary, was something that Graham carried in his memory with the specific completeness of a person whose formation within a place had been the kind of formation that encodes not just the explicit instruction, but the ambient sensory and social reality of the environment providing the instruction. He remembered the specific quality of the community's collective life, in the way that people remember the places where they were most thoroughly themselves before the events that made them something different, remembered it not as a collection of documented facts about an institution, but as a living texture of specific mornings and specific conversations and specific forms of shared labor and specific expressions of the care that the community's members extended to each other and to the people they encountered in the work their traditions sent them toward. The food prepared in communal kitchens for communal meals, the specific quality of the communal prayer that organized the day's beginning and the day's end, giving the hours between a framework that was not merely temporal but oriented, pointing the day toward something, rather than simply containing it within the passage of time. The specific ways different members of the community brought different gifts to the shared work, making the whole more than the sum of its parts, through the specific combination of their diverse capabilities applied to the common project of living seriously within a shared commitment to something larger than any individual's preferences or conveniences. He remembered the people with the specific vividness that genuine affection preserves, remembered them not as types or categories, but as individuals whose specific characters had been fully present to him in the daily proximity of the communal life they had shared. The elder whose particular combination of theological depth and practical wisdom had been the community's primary resource for the resolution of the various difficulties that any small community living in difficult conditions reliably generates. The younger missionaries whose enthusiasm and capability had represented the tradition's ongoing vitality, its continued ability to form people capable of carrying it forward into the territories its missionary mandate sent them into. The children whose presence in the community had been the most immediate and most undeniable evidence of the community's ongoing life, and the most concrete argument for the seriousness with which its members took the obligation to create conditions adequate to genuine human flourishing rather than merely functional survival. All of them gone. All of them taken by the specific violence that the Whitelegs had been organized and equipped and directed to deliver in service of Caesar's strategic calculation, a calculation whose terms had included their lives as costs, acceptable to the achievement of an objective whose character Graham understood with the full and painful precision of someone who had participated in the development of the methods that had produced it. The grief of their loss was not a grief that the years since had metabolized into something more manageable, in the way that grief sometimes metabolizes across sufficient time in circumstances that provide adequate resources for its processing. Graham did not have adequate resources for its processing in any simple sense, because the processing of grief at this scale and with this specific character required the kinds of communal and relational support that the grief's very content had eliminated, required the community that the grief was about, in order to be processed in the ways that genuine grief processing requires. And that community was the thing the grief was mourning. He carried the grief, therefore, in the specific and unresolved form that grief takes when the resources for its resolution have been eliminated, alongside the thing being grieved, carried it as a permanent feature of his interior. Landscape, present and real, and not moving toward any resolution that the circumstances of his life in the canyon were capable of providing, and he engaged with its presence in his interior landscape with the specific, honest acknowledgement that his faith required, rather than the various forms of management that a less demanding relationship to truth might have permitted. The tradition that New Canaan had embodied was itself a tradition with deep resources for engaging with grief of this scale, and this character resources developed across the long history of a religious community that had experienced the violent disruption of what it was building often enough and thoroughly enough to have developed a sophisticated relationship to the experience of communal loss and the specific forms of theological and practical response that the experience required. The tradition knew something about what it meant to lose everything and to continue anyway, knew something about the specific and demanding relationship between grief and hope that the continuation of a serious commitment in the aftermath of catastrophic loss required. And Graham's engagement with these resources was the engagement of someone using them for the specific purpose they had been developed for, rather than applying them as general consolatory principles to a situation whose specific demands they were not calibrated to address. He was not consoling himself. He was engaging with the question of what genuine continuation in the aftermath of genuine catastrophic loss actually required. And the tradition's resources for that engagement were resources he was using seriously rather than instrumentally. The new Canaanite understanding of what it meant to carry a tradition forward across the destruction of the community that had previously embodied it was an understanding organized around the specific conviction that the tradition's living reality resided not in its institutional forms alone, but in the people who had genuinely inhabited those forms, and that when the people were gone, the tradition's continuation depended on the willingness of the people who had received it to continue inhabiting it in whatever forms their specific circumstances made available, even when those forms were drastically reduced from what the full communal expression of the tradition had contained. This was not a comfortable understanding, because the reduced forms were genuinely reduced, genuinely less than what the full communal expression had been, genuinely unable to provide what the full communal expression had provided for the people within it. But it was an honest understanding, organized around the specific conviction that the reduced continuation was genuinely continuous with the full expression rather than simply adjacent to it, that the person attempting the continuation in reduced form was genuinely carrying forward the thing the full community had expressed, rather than simply performing the gestures associated with it in a context too depleted to give those gestures their proper meaning. Graham was attempting the continuation. The attempt was the form of his relationship to the tradition in the circumstances the destruction of New Canaan had made the only available circumstances, and the attempt's specific quality, its honesty, its cost, its willingness to be measured against the full standard of what the tradition required, rather than the reduced standard that the reduced circumstances might have seemed to justify, was itself the evidence that the continuation was genuine rather than merely formal. The arrival of the courier in Zion Canyon was, among its various dimensions of significance, the arrival of the first person from the broader wasteland who would encounter Graham in the context of his actual second life, rather than through the mediating lens of the legend that the broader wasteland had constructed around the first force, burned man figure. Every previous encounter Graham had had with people whose primary knowledge of him came from the legend rather than from direct engagement had been an encounter organized primarily around the legend's terms, around the specific version of Graham that the legend described, and the specific forms of fear or fascination or tactical assessment that the legend generated in the people encountering it. The courier's encounter was different in ways that the specific quality of the honest heart's narrative reflects and preserves different, because the courier's engagement with Graham was organized around the actual person, rather than the legendary figure, around the real character of the second life. The canyon had been the setting for, rather than around the projected continuation of the first life that the legend had assumed. What the courier encountered in Graham was not what the legend had prepared them to encounter. And the gap between the preparation and the encounter was itself one of the more informative aspects of what the Honest Heart's narrative documented about the relationship between the burned man's public reputation and his private reality. The legend had described a figure whose defining characteristics were the extreme physical survival and the capabilities, tactical, linguistic, military, that the Malpais legate had developed, and that the survival had preserved and presumably intensified through the specific alchemy of extreme experience. The actual person the courier encountered in Zion Canyon possessed those capabilities and that survival history, but those were not the defining characteristics of the person they encountered. The defining characteristics were the ones the legend had no resources for: the specific and demanding honesty, the theological engagement that was neither performative nor comfortable, the genuine and costly care for the canyon's communities that was visible in every dimension of his daily conduct, the specific quality of his relationship to his own history that distinguished it from every other person in the wasteland with a comparable history the courier had encountered or was likely to encounter. These were the things that made Graham specifically himself rather than the burned man, and they were the things the courier's engagement with him was organized around in the canonical encounters that the narrative preserves. The specific requests Graham made of the courier across the Honest Heart's narrative were requests whose character revealed more about the person making them than a simple tactical accounting of the situation's requirements would have made necessary to reveal. He asked for help with the military situation, which was the most immediately visible form of what the courier's presence in the canyon made available, the specific addition of capabilities that the defense of the canyon's communities required, and that Graham's own capabilities, however significant, could not provide unilaterally without the costs that unilateral action in this specific situation would impose on both the mission and the people. The mission was organized around protecting, but he also asked, in the less explicit and more pervasive form of genuine consultation across the narrative's unfolding events, for engagement with the questions the situation was raising from a perspective whose specific character was different from his own, from a perspective not shaped by his particular history and his particular commitments and his particular emotional investments in the specific outcomes the situation might produce. He was not asking the courier to substitute their judgment for his own or to override the conclusions his own knowledge of the situation had produced. He was asking for genuine engagement from a genuinely different position, and the asking was itself evidence of the specific change the canyon years had worked in him, the specific and genuine opening toward the possibility that other perspectives contained things his own did not, that the full picture of what the situation required was something that the combination of multiple perspectives might produce more adequately than any single perspective, even the perspective most deeply informed by the most years of the most direct engagement with the specific realities the situation contained. The courier's response to what Graham was and to what he was asking determined in significant part the specific character of the Honest Heart's narrative's resolution, and the range of possible responses the narrative made available to the courier reflected the genuine moral complexity of the situation, rather than the artificial complexity of a story whose available choices were organized around a predetermined correct answer. There was no resolution of the Honest Heart's situation that was simply right in all the dimensions the situation required to be addressed, no resolution that honored fully both the tactical requirements of the canyon's defense and the moral requirements of the community's dignity, both the specific claims that the White Leg's destruction of New Canaan seemed to make on Graham's anger, and the specific claims that the faith he had returned to made on the management of that anger, both the commitment to the dead horse's martial engagement and the commitment to the sorrow's preservation of the specific forms of their cultural life that the engagement threatened. The courier was being asked to navigate genuine complexity rather than to identify the correct answer in a situation whose correct answer had been determined in advance. And Graham's relationship to the various possible resolutions of that navigation reflected his understanding of the genuine complexity involved. The meaning that Joshua Graham's complete story accumulates across all of its sections and all of its dimensions is a meaning whose character resists the summary that the available narrative categories tend to impose on stories of comparable, dramatic intensity. It is not the meaning of the redemption arc, whose resolution is the completion of a transformation that the suffering has purchased and that the faith has directed toward its proper destination. It is not the meaning of the cautionary tale, whose resolution is the accounting for a life's costs in terms that confirm the inadequacy of the choices that produce them and the lesson that the inadequacy is supposed to teach. It is not the meaning of the legendary survival, whose resolution is the transformation of an extraordinary event into the evidence of an extraordinary nature that places its possessor outside the range of ordinary human moral reckoning and ordinary human moral accountability. The meaning is something smaller and more important than any of these available categories, something organized around the specific and daily and unglamorous and genuinely costly practice of trying to live differently from what you have been across the full weight of what you have been, without the guarantee that the trying is adequate to the moral reality it is organized in response to, and without the comfort of certainty about whether the specific form of accounting that the full moral reality requires is something your own efforts can provide. This is the meaning that the wasteland's dominant narrative frameworks had not developed adequate resources for accommodating, and its inadequate accommodation in those frameworks was not incidental to its significance, but related to its significance in the specific way that things whose genuine character exceeds the available categories for describing them are often most significant precisely in that excess, in the way that their resistance to the available categories reveals something about the limits of those categories and about the specific dimensions of human experience that the suffix limits leave unaddressed. Graham's story addressed those dimensions honestly. It addressed them with the specific quality of engagement that his particular history had made both unavoidable and possible unavoidable, because the history's specific character made the comfortable evasion of the questions it raised an evasion too dishonest for a person with his specific commitments to maintain, and possible because the same history that made the evasion unavailable had also produced, through the specific mechanisms of the canyon and the faith and the second life, a person capable of the sustained and honest engagement with the questions that the evasion's unavailability required. The story is the engagement is the meaning, and the meaning is available to anyone who engages with it with the quality of attention that the honest engagement with genuinely difficult things requires, not the attention of someone looking for the resolution that will permit relaxation, but the attention of someone willing to hold the tension that the genuine questions generate and to find in the holding itself the specific form of the understanding that the holding alone can produce. Rest now, fellow wanderer of the long dark, and let the red stone walls of Zion Canyon rise slowly around you in the quiet as the story settles and your breathing slows, and the specific weight of everything the night has carried begins to release its hold on you and allow you to drift toward the gentler territory where sleep waits, with the patience of things that have been waiting a very long time and that understand, in the way that patient things understand, that the arrival will come when it comes and cannot be compelled but only allowed. The story we have walked through tonight is the story of a man who fell into fire and climbed back out and spent the years of his second life doing something that had no adequate name in the wasteland's vocabulary, trying, with the specific and unglamorous and daily honesty that genuine trying requires of the people who undertake it seriously, to be different from what the most defining experiences of his life had made him capable of being, in a place whose specific and extraordinary beauty was itself a form of daily evidence that recovery across the aftermath of catastrophe was not merely theoretically possible, but actually occurring, that things could persist and develop and become genuinely worth protecting, even in a world that had organized itself so comprehensively around the logic of destruction and the aesthetics of what destruction leaves behind. Joshua Graham was not the burned man of the legend. He was not the fearsome and undying figure preserved in the amber of the Malpais legate's capabilities and projected forward through time by the specific fears of specific institutions that needed the figure to be what their fears required rather than what the surviving person actually was. He was not the completed saint of a convenient redemption narrative, the bad man made good through sufficient suffering, the wound healed to wholeness by the specific alchemy of fire and faith and the passage of adequate time. He was something the legend had never developed adequate categories for, and that the redemption narrative had never been designed to accommodate the specific and irreducible and genuinely complicated person that his specific and irreducible and genuinely complicated history had produced, attempting in real time and without a template the daily work of inhabiting a life whose requirements the history had not prepared him for, and whose specific character he was discovering through the inhabiting rather than before it. The attempt was genuine. The genuineness was visible and real in the specific quality of everything. The second life contained the honesty that did not protect itself, the care that did not manage its own costs, the willingness to be accountable to something larger than the comfort of a settled self-account, the specific and daily practice of bringing everything he was to the service of the specific people the canyon had made his responsibility, including the things about himself that the practice required him to acknowledge rather than conceal. The attempt was not enough, in the sense that no attempt across the full weight of what his history contained could be simply and completely enough. But it was not nothing. It was one of the more significant things the Wastelands record contains, not because its significance was recognized in the ways that the Wasteland tended to recognize significance, not through the public forms of acknowledgement that the Wasteland extended to its most dramatically effective actors, but because it was the form of significance that the most serious and most demanding engagement with the question of how to live after having lived as he had lived could produce. And the production was genuine, and the genuineness was not incidental to the significance, but its very substance. Let the canyon hold you now as it held him. Let its specific and ancient patience settle around you, the way the stone settles around the light at the end of a long day in Zion, receiving it, holding it, releasing it slowly into the dark as the temperature drops and the stars appear one by one over the canyon's rim, with the specific unhurried sequence of things that have been appearing in this order for longer than any of the human stories conducted beneath them, and that will continue appearing in this order long after the human stories have reached whatever conclusions they reach. The canyon is patient with human stories. It has held them across the full span of the human presence in its territory, the pre-war and the post-war, and all the ancient years before the war, was a possibility that anyone in the territory was capable of imagining, and it holds the story of Joshua Graham's second life with the same patient and undemanding presence. It extends to all the other stories that have been lived within its red walls and its moving water and its specific and extraordinary quality of light. The fire that did not kill Joshua Graham is still burning somewhere in the accumulated meaning of what his second life represented, burning not with the destructive heat of the fire that was meant to end him, but with the quieter and more persistent quality of conviction sustained across difficulty, of the attempt continued past the point where the attempt's continuation required more than the person making it was certain they possessed, of the specific and austere form of hope that remains available to people who have honestly evaluated what has been lost and honestly assessed what remains, and who have concluded, without the comfort of certainty about the conclusion's adequacy, that what remains is worth continuing to bring to the work that the remaining makes possible. Close your eyes now, wanderer. The canyon is quiet around you. The stone is warm with the long day's collected light, holding it the way stone holds warmth, not dramatically, not with any announcement of the holding, but simply and completely, and for longer than you might expect, given how gently the warmth expressed itself while the sun was present to provide it. Let the warmth of the stone be the last thing you are aware of before sleep takes you, and let it carry with it the specific quality of what persists in the dark, the things that endure after the light that warmed them has gone, that continue to offer what they collected during the hours of exposure, long into the hours of dark, quietly and without drama, and for exactly as long as the accumulated warmth requires. Sleep, fellow wanderer. The story has been told. The canyon holds its vigil so that you may rest. The figure in white bandages moves through the dark of the red stone walls with the specific, unhurried patience of someone who has learned, across the full weight of everything the learning cost, that the work continues for as long as the continuing is possible, and that the continuing is its own form of the grace available in this world to the people who do not stop. Sleep now. The fire that should have ended him did not. The canyon that should have kept him could not. And the second life that neither should have permitted persists in the red stone and the moving water and the long patient dark, as permanent as anything in the wasteland is permanent, as enduring as the attempt itself, which is to say, enduring enough